Story 1. This happened to me a while back when I decided to go on another camping trip alone. I always liked camping alone. There's something serene and sobering about being isolated in the middle of the wilderness, and I always found it relaxing. So I planned out what trail I was going to take, packed my camping gear and my rifle for protection, and jumped in my truck. I get to this trail early in the morning and hike about 15 to 20 miles in until I find the right spot and head off the trail to find a place to put my tent up. I stumble upon this nice-sized clearing and decide that it's a nice, beautiful spot to settle down. I'm exhausted at this point, but set up the tent at the southernmost edge of the clearing next to the tree line and manage to get a fire going. I roast some weenies and start to hear a sound in the distance underneath all the forest noise. It sounded like an animal, most likely a deer, with a lame leg, as it sounded like the animal was making a walking or dragging noise. I felt bad for the poor guy, but it was too far away and it was getting dark, so I couldn't really go find it and put it out of its misery. Think nothing of it after that and go about eating my food. After I eat, I douse the fire and crawl into my tent and insert myself into my sleeping bag. I decide that even at my exhausted and relaxed state, I can't go to sleep, so I pull out a book I brought with me and start to read by the light of my lamp. Hours go by and I hear that sound again, this time closer, right at the opposite side of the clearing. Surprised, I put my book down and listen to this animal walk drag across the clearing towards my tent. It's really loud at this point, and it now sounds like the hooves are all being heavily planted with the dragging noise following seconds after, like the deer is dragging something along. It makes it to about what I assume is the middle of the clearing and stops, and I hear nothing. No breathing, I mean not a sound from this animal. I unzip the tent and look into the clearing. Nothing but trees and darkness. What the fick? Unnerved at this point, I zip the tent back up and sit there listening for other noises. Nothing, just the crickets and the breeze. I decide that there are a lot of strange noises in the woods and tried not to let it bother me. Besides, I had my rifle. I start to doze off when I hear men's laughter off in the distance to my right, then women's laughter and sticks snapping far off to my left. I'm up now, wondering if what I'm hearing is really what I'm hearing or just a product of being half asleep. I hear more faint laughter from a couple other different directions. All different, that is old men, old women, even children, and confirm that it's real. The noises are closing in and I grab my rifle, preparing to fire a warning shot off in the air in case they came too close. Something about this laughter, how far in I was, the noise earlier, and the time of night told me that this was not just another family strolling through. I was on edge enough already, but then I noticed that the nightlife was dead quiet. Not even the wind was making any noise. I decided enough was enough. I unzipped the tent and fired a shot into the night. I sat there and surveyed the tree line, saw nothing. Listened intently to my surroundings. No laughing, and the forest sounds had returned. Relaxing just a bit and figuring that scared whoever off, I sat down and in my exhausted state I fell asleep. I wake up later in a cold sweat, racked with anxiety, and it was still dark outside. I immediately hear two people whispering not too far from my tent, alert. Grab my rifle and listen to what they are saying. I can't make out much, but I hear something about being lost, so I shout, "Hey, who's there?" The voices fall silent. I shout again, "Are you guys lost? Who's there?" Suddenly, a huge burst of flame like a flamethrower erupted from the middle of the clearing, illuminating several silhouettes of people just standing around. In shock, I fire my rifle, blowing a hole in the front of my tent, and it goes dark. Without checking my surroundings, I get up and sprint out of my tent, making a hard left back to where the trail was. I hiked until sunrise back to my truck with my head over my shoulder the entire way. Never heard anyone follow me, never saw anyone or anything the whole way, but couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. After that, my enjoyment of camping alone left me like I left all my gear in the woods that night. Story 2. This happened to me when I was a teenager. I think it was the spring of 1998 when I was 14. My Boy Scout troop went hiking in the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. I grew up in a very small town in Tennessee, and the boys in my troop were people I'd known my whole life, and we were all very close and knew each other very well and trusted each other. We'd been hiking for 5 days or so, and it was miserable. It rained every day, and we were all exhausted and sore and hungry and covered with blisters. The adults realized we'd bitten off more than we could chew in trying to hike a 60-mile trail, especially with the awful weather, so we'd changed course and gotten off the trail to spend the night in a drive-in campground, the kind of place with hookups for RVs and picnic tables and fire pits, grills, and a central bathhouse with showers and toilets. It was in a very remote area far from a town or a house. There may have been a few other small groups there, but if there were, we never interacted with or saw any of them. We were all filthy and wet, and thus very excited about taking a hot shower. It was dark and we'd finished dinner. A group of 5 of my friends, including my friend Jeremy, who, like everyone else in our group, I had known since we were babies, headed up to the bathhouse, which was maybe a quarter-mile walk through the pitch-dark woods up a worn-down gravel walking trail. I stayed behind to clean up, and after 10 or 15 minutes followed them by myself. I had a weak little flashlight, the old incandescent kind pre-LED. I remember the woods were totally silent. When I got about halfway to the bathhouse, I could see the light from it off in the distance through the woods. I heard a noise to my left and I looked over and saw my friend Jeremy standing by an old-school manual water pump about 20 feet off the trail. The kind of pump where you raise and lower a handle to pump water up from a well. There was a strange light around him like the moon had come out from behind the clouds. I was startled to see him there by himself in the woods off the trail. I asked him if he was already done with his shower. He seemed kind of sad and he said, "Yeah, it's all yours." I said okay and didn't think much of it until I got to the bathhouse. When I walked in the door, my friends were all in there and I heard Jeremy talking from in the shower. All the blood drained out of my head and all the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had to sit down before I passed out. My friends were freaked out and wanted to know what was wrong. I told them what had happened. They nervously made jokes about how I must have been smoking pot. This was long before any of us had experimented with any mind-altering substances, but I could tell they believed me. Like I said, we'd known each other forever and knew when one of us was exaggerating or playing a joke. We all waited together until everyone was finished showering and brushing teeth and whatnot, and then walked back together in total silence. When we got to the spot I had seen, whoever, he was gone without a trace. The water pump was there, though. No one had noticed it before because it was a ways off the trail and obviously not in use. We got back to our campsite and went to bed freaked out. I remember not sleeping much that night. In all the years since then, I've never been able to figure out what happened. Was there a random teenage boy in the woods who looked just like my friend? Unlikely. Did I hallucinate it? Also unlikely. Who's to say? Story 3. As a child, I would always camp out with the family. It has become a tradition. Every summer, we'd head down to this spot by the side of the highway. My uncle, whom I'll call Richard, owns the property there and had allowed to stay there for as long as we wanted, as long as we cleaned up afterwards. We had packed the usual things, a few tents, a cooler for the booze for the cooler, some stuff to grill over the campfire, a magnesium fire starter, hunting knife, and a my stepdad's .44 revolver in case of coyotes. We live in southwest Texas, so it isn't uncommon to run into them. Everything started off normal. Everyone was having a good time. The kids and myself, we all off having fun, skipping rocks across the river and fishing, unsuccessfully, while the adults were by the tents watching over us. Everything was nice, I guess. If only I knew that would change. The next morning started like the other ones while we were there. The adults were sluggishly moving around, hungover from drinking all night while the kids and I slept. We would stay asleep until someone started to cook over the campfire. After we would wake up, the rest of the day would carry on. We'd walk around the area, but never too far. It's not that we weren't allowed to. We had always just feared going too far out into the woods without the adults. We'd always go to this clearing every time we went. It was like another camp clearing, except the fact that it was eerily darker than the surrounding area and had this atmosphere over it that would draw us in. We only left because we'd be called back to our camp. The sun set over the hills around us, and that signaled bedtime. The adults would make sure we got to our tents and then went back to the campfire to drink and laugh. Though they went to bed this night instead. I assumed they were just tired as well, with the nightly drinking and all. I couldn't fall asleep that night. I tossed and turned, eventually managing to shove my little brother off the air mattress in our tent. I decided I needed to relieve myself. So I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and went off into the woods. The walk to nature's restroom felt longer than usual. Must have been the dark, right? I had eventually found a spot that I thought would be okay to in and dumped off there. It's when nature's call had vanished that I noticed little lights moving in the trees. I, being the curious 15-year-old I was, followed them. After what felt like hours of staying off of paths and behind trees, we got to the clearing the kids and I had always gone to. The lights turned out to be men in hooded cloaks, the color of blood red, carrying torches into a triangle in the clearing. In the middle was a cross. Another hooded figure had stepped into the triangle and hung what looked like a person in a horse mask. I had managed to get a better look at what it was. These sick ficks had sewed on a horse's head onto someone. I wanted to puke. Why would someone do this? The hooded men started chanting. Another brought in a woman, whose eyes were covered by a blindfold and her hands and feet were bound by rope. They set her down in the triangle facing the cross. The man that had brought her in removed her blindfold. She looked up at the cross and let out the most blood-churning scream I had ever heard. The hooded men began chanting again, increasing in volume as the man in the triangle lifted his hands to reveal a blade. As he brought it into the air, the chanting stopped. He began to speak in some kind of unknown language. Latin, I assumed. The hooded man brought the blade to the woman's throat and stopped speaking. Then suddenly he shouted. To this day I still hear his words. May your tainted blood awaken thy sour soul. Upon shouting those words, he dragged the blade across her neck, and removing her head from her body, holding her head up to the cross. The man-horse thing on the cross began to shake and thrash. Later, it began to scream. It was horrifying. It sounded so unnatural, like it wanted to scream out its own innards. Then, it looked at me. It wasn't like it just glanced at me. It full-on locked eyes with me. That's when I decided I've seen enough. I turned on my heels and ran. I ran faster than I thought I ever could. I got back to the camp and made sure I wasn't followed. Thankfully, I wasn't. I guess I was gone longer than it seemed, because the sun was starting to rise again. To this day, I still don't know what I saw, but I know I saw it. It still haunts me. Those gaping eyes locking with mine. I think that day I lost my soul through my eyes. I'll never know what happened, and I wish I hadn't seen it. Never. Am I going back there again? Story 4. I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington near Mount Rainier. Like, not an official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night I wake up and hear something, open my tent, and there is a guy sitting by where my fire had been right outside my tent. Nothing particularly noteworthy about the guy, just a fairly regular-looking dude just sitting there a couple feet from my tent. No bag or pack or anything with him. Just a guy. He saw me open the tent. His eyes got huge like he had just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day I managed to put it out of my mind fairly well after writing it off as just some odd occurrence and a guy that was probably high or something, and had somehow managed to set up a camp coincidentally not far from mine. Then 2 days after that, and 15 miles away in totally random directions that nobody could take the same path as on accident. I was sitting by the fire that night and started hearing noises that I got more and more convinced were a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness someone was like, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said no. I don't even think that's a real place there. They kept talking from just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that away," and kind of spooked and not wanting to piss off a potentially crazy person. I did. After like 15 minutes of me being very freaked out and them talking and asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer, so I shined my light that way again. And it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had to have followed me almost 15 miles over 2 days because there is no way he could have just accidentally wound up in the same spot as vast as that wilderness is. No possible way. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again. I started to chase him, but didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the dark, so stopped quickly after probably only 200 feet. This one couldn't be written off, because the only way he could have been in both places is specifically if he was following me. I decided the trip was very over first thing in the morning, and hiked back out over 3 days, constantly doubling back, trying to throw anyone following off my trail, and occasionally hiding and waiting to see if he would come by following me. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the woods, and to actually have to brainstorm on things I could do to best avoid potentially being murdered. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent, but by the time I mustered the courage to look, nobody was there. On the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first in the distance, but slowly decided sounded more like a human making animal calls, but could have actually been an animal. But I didn't actually see the guy again. But it really sounded like a person making howling noises. I literally almost cried when I finally got back to my car. The relief was so strong. To this day, probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. I have no idea who the guy was or what his intentions were, and no way of getting an explanation, but I really can't articulate just what a terrifying few days it was.